And we're live. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Sunday School. Uh, Quick housekeeping stuff. A little bit of correction from last episode, last Sunday School lesson. The Catholic restriction of eating fish during Lent is only on Fridays. It's not the whole entire 40 days, like I said. It's only on Fridays. Still an arbitrary eating requirement, but do as the Holy Spirit leads you on that sort of thing. And then the other thing is the ashes that they do, the little cross on your forehead for Ash Wednesday, apparently are palm leaves, like palm fronds, palm leaves that are, I guess, left over from the year before. I don't know how frequently they burn them to create the ash that they put on your forehead. So that's where the ashes come from. It's not any kind of weirdness. I didn't think it was, but someone let me know that it comes from the burnt palm fronds, palm leaves, which I guess would be a reference to Palm Sunday. I don't know. Again, nothing. It's not really biblical, but if you feel led to do those things, like I said last week, do it as unto the Lord. So today, I get the honor of doing a wedding this afternoon, kind of a short notice thing, but that's why I'm dressed up. I have my spiffy little tie on. I actually really like this tie. Ordered it online. It looked cool on the app when I was looking at it, and then when I got it, it looked even better in the app. So I was like, that's really cool. So sitting there thinking about it, what are we going to talk about? What are we going to discuss? And this is kind of the disadvantage of not going from pre-written Sunday school lessons like you might buy from Lifeway or some other source. But like I said, I prefer to go straight out of the Bible and have biblical content, not just regurgitate somebody else's opinion. I know my opinion does get interjected into these things, but I try to minimize it as much as possible and give you what's actually in the Bible. And as I have been watching some other people who are kind of new to the faith, or kind of new to doing like a podcast kind of a thing, or doing lessons like this, and they're not necessarily Sunday school teachers, but they're Christians who want to share the word. And so as I watch their videos, and I thought I wanted to sit there and criticize and critique. If there's something I think needs to be said in response to something they've said, I will do it. But I want to go and look at their sources and things like that. And so a lot of people are kind of trying to get into this whole end times thing. Is when is Christ coming back? Is Armageddon fast approaching? Where are we in the whole timeline of things? And biblically speaking, because as I mentioned with Ukraine and Russia kind of coming back on the scene as a world power again, or trying to come back as a world power and regain some of their prominence they had when they were part of the Soviet Union. That's a lot of people are looking at that going, hey, this is the Gog and Magog people, and this is mentioned in Revelation and whatnot. So as I hear people talk about this stuff, I look into these different videos and pastors and whatever writings and websites they claim is they're getting their information from. And as far as when the Lord returns, we have, God tells us plainly, Christ says it, no one knows the day nor the hour, nobody but my Father in heaven, right? So God is the only one who knows when he's coming back. And, of course, for us as Christians, it's the second coming. For a lot of Jews, they look at it as the first coming. And, then there's a lot of other belief systems there. But one of the things I keep hearing is that Christ will come back, that the Messiah will come during the feast, one of the feasts, right? And there's 7 ordained by God feasts. And then there's a couple others, but specifically in the Bible, let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so there's 9 feasts total. There's 7 that are specifically ordained by God, and that's in Leviticus. And we're going to get into those 7. Then we'll get into the other 2, just because they're popular and common amongst Jews to this day. And so that's what we're going to be discussing. And the first one coming up, obviously, is Passover, and we're a few weeks away from that. I think Easter is April 17th. Passover is going to start on like the 14th or the 15th, and so that's the first one coming up, and so there's some other things so I was kind of inspired by what we need to understand what these feasts are, and we need to understand it's blessings by God. It's what's in the Bible. We need to know what's in the Bible. Our Jewish brothers and sisters are out there celebrating these things. Do we have to, as Christians, as Gentile Christians, do we absolutely need to observe these, and specifically the way God says to do? Not really. If you want to observe them, that's your business. Go ahead. Again, do it as unto the Lord. Do it for His glory, not yours. And and it wouldn't hurt. I say it's not going to hurt to do these things. At least recognize them. It might help you kind of get a little better mindset as to what the Jews are dealing with and how they're going through their stuff. But and the reason I bring up the feasts is there's a lot of end times people out there trying to say that Christ is going to come back during the Feast of Booths or Feast of Tabernacles. And I love how Amir Sarfati put it. He's in one of his videos he was speaking somewhere, and he says, all these people who say Christ is going to come back at the Feast of Tabernacle, and every year they're disappointed. And it's not just to make fun of people, but it's no one knows the day nor the hour. And I was listening to a guy that a friend of mine cited as a good source, and she'd watched some of his videos and stuff. And he's a pastor out somewhere who claims to know. He won't set a date on when Christ is going to come back, but he claims to know because he did the math. Well, that video was from a year ago, and we're still here. So his math was clearly not correct. And if you remember a guy named Harold Camping, probably over 10 years ago, I guess, he was the last big name guy to really try and predict exactly when the rapture was going to happen, right? And I think he ended up coming up with like 3 dates in a year. And, the first one happened. I was off. My calculation was a little off. It's this date. That one happened. The next date, that didn't happen. Then after that, it was a big embarrassment and a big problem with that. And this actually happened. Some of his congregants, of people there were people that tried to warn him and said, hey, look, you're going down the wrong path here. You don't need to be doing this. And you're getting too much attention for yourself, and the Bible doesn't confirm what you're saying. You need to listen to those people, obviously. But I remember reading an article, and there was a couple that went and moved out into the woods. They quit paying their mortgage. They quit doing all that stuff. And then this is what's even more bizarre, and this is, again, the big danger of claiming you know what prophecy specifically is, or when things are going to happen. If it's, especially when the Bible says no one knows the day nor the hour, and you're sitting there claiming to know it. And so the danger is, anyways, this couple, again, they leave their home, they quit paying their mortgage and all that. Well, they just happen to leave their children behind in their home. And so they had like 3 sons, and they were feeding themselves. I mean, it was months before DHR ever figured out that they were living on their own. And when they came and tried to take the house, the bank comes in to foreclose on the mortgage and find out there's children living in this house. Well, the couple was living out in the woods waiting for, Christ to return and the rapture to happen, right? And it's like, so you have to be very careful. Be very, very careful. And so, nobody's putting dates out there, but like this guy I was watching, well, I did the math. I don't know exactly when he's coming back, but I did the math. and I wrote a little comment in the YouTube video. I said, well, you did the math, but we're still here a year later. So, we don't know. A whole generation, maybe it's 70, 80 years, maybe it's less, maybe it's more. I've heard people say we're on a 6,000 year schedule, in which case, according to the Hebrew calendar, we're, I don't know, like 5,780 something years, I think, was the last thing I heard from creation. So that would put us, if we're on the 6,000 year schedule that some people have claimed, that puts us still a couple hundred years from the return of Christ. And so, we don't know. We don't know how long it's going to take for all this Russia stuff to settle out. We don't know what it's going to look like when it's all said and done. We don't know when they're going to attack Israel, if that really is the bear that the prophecy speaks about. A lot of scholars on Jewish side of things and Christian side of things agree that the bear mentioned in prophecy is Russia and those people up in that region, so Russia, Ukraine area. The former Byzantine empires I mentioned before. And so, but the feast though, and that's, God does all these things during the feast. And if you look through all this stuff, and that's, so when God comes back, God also said he's going to come as a thief in the night. When we're not prepared, when we're not ready, we're not going to know. And so, there'll be two in the field and one will be left. There'll be, two over here and one will be left. And so we have no idea. But so to fill the time until I get Amir Sarfati's book, we're going to go through some of these feasts. We're going to go through all of them. Like I said, there's 7 specifically ordained feasts, and there's 2 feasts that still honor God, but they're not specifically ordained by God. They were ordained by man. And we have a lot of stuff like that. Especially in American culture, we have our holidays, right? Of course, holidays is a derivative of holy days. And what does holy mean? It means to be set apart. So these are days that are set apart for a reason, to honor someone or something. We have 4th of July to honor the founding of America and the beginning of the Revolutionary War. We have Memorial Day to honor the fallen soldiers who have fought for this country. We have Veterans Day to honor the soldiers who are still, and veterans who are still alive. There's actually a distinction there. So Memorial Day is for the ones who've passed, and Veterans Day is for the ones who are still living. And we want to say thank you and honor people who put on a uniform and fight and defend this nation. And that's fine. And then we have Valentine's Day, right? That's an interesting one. Every February, and it's kind of devolved into this buy cards and candy and roses thing and just spend lots of money, right? And that's kind of the progressive politician thing when you look at the history of Thanksgiving, which Thanksgiving was a celebration to thank God for the colonists to be able to actually survive through the winter, and to, and they made friends with some of the Indians that were there, American Indians that were there. And, so Thanksgiving was a celebration and to give thanks to God for being able to survive. And today, though, because of progressive politicians, they've moved it closer and closer, and then they came up with Black Friday, and so now it's gorge yourself on turkey and, get your little tryptophan hangover and camp out on the couch, so the next day you can get up and go and spend lots of money at, a store somewhere where you might get in a fight over sheets that are only marked off like 10%. I mean, it really is, the value and the meaning of Thanksgiving has been diminished. Valentine's, you might say, well, it commemorates the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Well, it goes back even before that to when there was a monk, preacher, pastor guy, whatever, somebody over in Ireland, I think, Ireland, Scotland, somewhere in the UK, who, when weddings were banned amongst common people, the lords and the ladies and the royalty and stuff could marry all they want to, but the common folks couldn't, right? And so this guy, Valentine, was actually secretly doing weddings. And weddings are a biblical thing. It's to honor God. So, there's a lot of interesting origins. And so, holidays are not unknown to us here in America. And some are just really weird and arbitrary. Others have true, deeper meanings. And so we kind of take them for granted, and especially the biblical ones. So we're going to jump into, make sure I'm started a little bit late. As I've said before, I use an old iPhone. I use the old iPhone for Facebook because iPhones are kind of screwy. If you get to a point where you've forgotten your password, or it's locked me out. It won't let me update my password, so I can't update any of the apps on the iPhone, which I don't use for cell service anymore. And went back to Android. So I use my Android for Twitch because it's not working and I can't update it on the iPhone, so I use the iPhone for Facebook. And then, of course, I download these to my computer at home and upload them to Rumble. But I guess my iPhone was like frozen. We had this cold snap come through, and my iPhone didn't want to start up this morning. I plugged it into the wall and plugged the cord in. It's another thing to do with the iPhone is the battery is really weird. It fluctuates. Before I quit using it, I'd had it about 2 years. And so, ain't technology grand. But anyways, we're up and running, and we'll jump right into the first officially sanctioned, ordained by God holiday or feast, and that is the Feast of Passover. And of course, we all know the story. Exodus chapter 12. The Israelites are in Egypt. They've been enslaved. Moses was saved when they killed all the little kids and grew up in the palace. He killed a guard and he ran away. And he went and hid out in the wilderness, out in the desert, for at least another 40 years. So he was like 40 when he left Egypt. He spent 40 years out there and married, his father was Jethro, and he married Miriam. He was somewhere around Ethiopia somewhere, a little bit north of current modern day Ethiopia. But anyways, he comes back into town, finds his brother. God uses him to do all the miracles and the plagues and stuff to convince Pharaoh to let him go out of Egypt. And Pharaoh kept refusing, and his heart was hardened and kept getting harder and harder. And so, like, the final straw to break the camel's back that God does is Passover. And it was a curse to kill all the firstborn children and firstborn livestock in all of Egypt. And so what the Israelites had to do, let's see here. All right, so Exodus chapter 12, starting in verses 2 through 20, gives you your background and instructions on what they were to do that night. And of course, we all know, we all should know this. It should be fairly commonplace, especially since it happens right around Easter every year. So kind of with the Easter celebrations, Resurrection Day celebrations, we throw in Passover, and pastors will get up and preach and teach about this kind of thing. But it's a very real thing, very big thing for the Jews. And this is actually when God said this is going to be your first month. So when God started their official calendar as Israelites, he started it with Passover. And that you actually learn that in Leviticus chapter 23. So let's see here. Like I said, starting in verse 2, this month, well, you learn it here in Exodus as well. This month is to be the beginning of months for you. It is the first month of your year. Verse 3, tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month they must each select an animal of the flock according to their father's families, one animal per family. If the household is too small for a whole animal, the person and the neighbor nearest his house are to select one based on the combined number of people. You should apportion the animal according to what each will eat. So if you're poor and you can't afford it, you go to your neighbor, and your neighbor's supposed to share with you. So whoever has the most is supposed to support and help whoever has the least. And they're told that they did get a 1-year-old lamb, and they can either be a sheep or a goat, and they separate it out for 7 days. And so during all this, we do, when we do the Lord's Supper, and we have, it just depends on your church and what they can get a hold of. Some, I've seen churches use tortillas. That's an unleavened, that's a flatbread. I've seen churches go out and actually get matzah crackers, which are specifically Jewish. Their recipe, they're kosher. That's actually used by Jews today in their seders and their feast meals, specifically for Passover. They do it other times too, but it's very traditional things. And I've seen people use unsalted saltines. Yeah, whatever works. It's the Catholics actually teach during the Lord's Supper, which they do every service. Baptists and other so-called Protestant denominations, we typically do it 3, 4, 5 times a year, maybe 6, but we don't do it. Catholics do it every single service. And they claim that when you eat the bread, it actually turns into the flesh of Christ. And when you drink the wine, once it enters into your mouth, it becomes the true blood of Christ. And that's kind of weird. There's nothing in the Bible that supports that. I think it's called transmogrification or something like that. It's weird, and that's the Catholic belief system there. But again, nothing biblical about that. Actually has some pagan roots, I think. But it's the Lord's Supper is a time to remember what God does for us, and it's a time to get closer to God. And it's something that, Christ instituted, God instituted before Christ did. And so, it's supposed to be a sacred thing that has meaning. But it does have its origins here with the Passover. So like I said, they have the 1-year-old lamb of some type, and blemish free. It has to be blemish free. It cannot be a spot on it. It has to be all white, pure. It represents purity. And of course, this was foreshadowing for Christ. Christ was going to be the perfect sacrifice, the perfect lamb, right? So when they take this lamb and they slaughter it, they take the blood from slaughtering it and they put it on the doorposts of their homes. And so when the death angel came through, it would skip the houses that had blood on the doorposts. And so those people would be spared. And, but that's part of it. The other part of this is the unleavened bread. And if you know anything about making bread, and I've somewhere, I don't know if I still have it or not, I got a bread maker while I was stationed in Japan. I won it at a contest party thing one night or something. I don't know. But I started making my own bread in this thing, and it was kind of neat. Now, this is, you buy the box of the bread mix. And of course the yeast was separate, and so there was like a certain procedure that I had to put it, make a little divot down in there. There's a little mixer thing, so like you pour the powder in there, you pour the fluid in there, whatever water, oil you got to put in there, and then you pour the yeast on top of that, and the mixer, the bread maker would mix all of it up for you. But the breads that had yeast in them, which was basically about everything I did, it had to rise and fall like 2 or 3 times before it was ready to cook. So when you use yeast to cook bread, it takes a long time. And of course, Christ uses the yeast and leaven, as they call it in the Bible, to get into talking about contamination from foreign gods and from foreign false religions. A little bit of yeast goes a long way. It doesn't take very much yeast at all to raise a loaf of bread. And so they made unleavened bread. So they left the yeast out. So you can make bread, you make a flat bread really fast, no yeast in it. And so they had to do that. And then they had, so that was part of their thing. And that was one of the things God told them, be dressed and ready to run. So when the Passover happens, they're going to wake up. In other words, the Egyptians are going to wake up the next morning. And of course, the Pharaoh at that time had a young son, his firstborn son. And he gets up the next morning and he's dead. And then everybody all over Egypt is wailing and crying and freaking out because all the firstborn children are dead and all the firstborn livestock are dead. And now, that's why he told the Israelites, be ready to go, be dressed and ready to go, and have your unleavened bread. That was going to be their initial food to get them started in the wilderness until, as we learned, he supplied them with manna. And so, it had to be done quickly. They didn't have time for it to rise and fall, however many times bread has to do that with yeast in it. And so, and they couldn't leave any of if they had any of their food left over, any of the lamb that was left over that they cooked that night, it had to be burnt up. You couldn't leave any food behind. And so, let's see here. Verse 14, this day is to be a memorial for you, and you must celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. You are to celebrate it throughout your generations as a permanent statute. You must eat unleavened bread for 7 days. On the first day you must remove yeast from your houses. Whoever eats what is leavened from the first day through the 7th day must be cut off from Israel. So if you didn't do God's instructions exactly right, you didn't get to Exodus with everybody else. You were going to be cut off from the rest of Israel. You'd be stuck in Egypt. And then you have to face because you're a Jew, you have to face the wrath of Pharaoh, who's going to be upset about all the stuff that happened, right? Of course, we all know that he chased the Israelites up to the Red Sea, and Moses part of the Red Sea, and etc. So that is the beginning of Passover. And again, that's Exodus chapter 12. Let's see here. And the leaven thing, and Christ uses the same analogy, and actually it does go back to Exodus back here. As you read, anybody eating anything that's leavened is cut off from Israel. And that's the whole thing with being trapped in Egypt. They were enslaved in Egypt. Egypt was comfortable. Egypt was sinful. They had false gods. They had false religions. They weren't honoring God. Not Yahweh, Jehovah was not being worshipped. Their false deities and whatnot were being worshipped, and the Israelites were becoming more like the Egyptians. Plus, they were enslaved. And God wanted better than that for his children, for the people of Israel. And so, eating anything with leaven in it was basically like you weren't going to give up the comfort of your sin. You weren't going to give up the comfort of your enslavement for better things. If God wants you to give something up, there's a very good chance that he has something better in store for you. And whether it's just being more holy or whether it's an actual something, whatever that you're to be blessed with because you listened to God and you gave something up. And so, I love bread. It's really not good when you're on a diet, but, you know, sourdough, pumpernickel, rye, pumpernickel especially. I could sit down with a whole loaf of pumpernickel when I was younger in a tub of butter and a toaster and just eat the whole loaf of bread. I mean, I do that nowadays, I'd probably get sick and wake up weighing 20 pounds heavier. But, you know, bread is a comfort food, right? Flatbread's not so much. I mean, if pita bread, and I love a good gyro, and I love to stuff a pita with something, but it's all about what you put in the pita. You know, one of those it's a Greek Mediterranean thing. It's a flatbread, but it doesn't have that same. It's what you put in it, as opposed to just being able to eat bread by itself. Like I said, I could eat, you know, buttered pumpernickel all day long. Love it. A pita flatbread thing, you got to put something in it. You know, it's a vehicle to hold whatever meat or substance you want to, you know, make your sandwich out of. And so, you know, I definitely see the appeal, and I see the analogy here of leaven, which basically it's sin. A little bit, doesn't take much sin, and it grows to be much bigger, right? So that's why God told him, if you eat anything that with leaven in it, you're cut off. You're not going to be part of this. You're staying behind in Egypt. And that's kind of what Christ was saying to his disciples in the New Testament is, beware of the Pharisees' leaven. Beware of, you know, it's just a little bit of falsehood becomes something much bigger than it should be. A little bit of false religion turns into a big deal. A little bit of sin will take you farther, keep you longer, and cost you more than you ever wanted to spend. And, you know, like I said, a little bit of leaven will raise a loaf of bread. And, you know, so you want to avoid it. And like I said, they needed to run quickly. They didn't need a big giant loaf of bread in their whatever their sacks were that they were carrying. So they made flatbread. So you know, that's the intent there. So Passover, like I said, this is the first month of the Jewish calendar's Passover, and this year. It's going to start like April 15th, I believe, is the beginning of Passover. It's a 7-day period, and that's in here in Exodus, and it shows up in Leviticus chapter 23. Around verse 5, the Passover to the Lord comes in the first month at twilight on the 14th day of the month, which is then followed by the festival of unleavened bread. And so for 7 days you must not eat unleavened bread. So the instruction now, Leviticus is the book of the law, right? This is law specific. This is their moral and civil laws for Israel. How they're to conduct themselves as a religion, as a society, how they're to conduct themselves as people, how they treat foreigners, how they stay holy and sanctified amongst all the Gentiles, right? Because they're going into the promised land, going into the land of Canaan, and they're going to encounter all these false religions. They're going to encounter the giants and all these different people who are already living there that are enemies to God because they are doing evil religious practices, right? They're sacrificing children. They're doing all kinds of weird stuff. And so in order to maintain the Israelites' identity, God gives them the laws in Leviticus. And so part of it is these different feasts, these different holy times to commemorate and celebrate God and what he's done for them and what he will do. And, you know, so that's what's in Leviticus. It's specific. Now, because if you notice, like in Exodus, he said on the 10th day, then you get a lamb, and you set it apart for 7 days. So then you get up to Leviticus when God's instituting these civil laws for the Israelites. He says, you know, here verse 5, at twilight on the 14th day of the month. And so as you read into the prescription for the holy days, and Leviticus chapter 23 gives you all of the God ordained holy days, feasts as they're called. They all started on Passover. They all start on the Sabbath, and so there's a lot of misunderstanding of the Sabbath, and like work, don't work. What is exactly work? And Christ healed people on the Sabbath. They walked places on the Sabbath. They traveled on the Sabbath. They were in the temple teaching on the Sabbath. They were, so they did all these things that the Sadducees and the Pharisees said they weren't supposed to do, because they had so legalized and manipulated and twisted the Sabbath to go from being a day where you didn't work to a day where you had to work so hard to not work, and you couldn't save a person's life, you couldn't save an animal. It was just really bizarre restrictions. They had just taken it too far. But let's see here, chapter 23. Well, starting in verse 2 in Leviticus 23, speak to the Israelites and tell them, these are my appointed times, the times of the Lord that you will proclaim as sacred assemblies. Older translation might say convocations. Let's see, verse 3, work may be done for 6 days, but on the seventh day there is to be a Sabbath of complete rest, a sacred assembly. You are not to do any work. It is the Sabbath to the Lord wherever you live. And, with the 10 Commandments, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Keep it set apart for the Lord, which means you're not going to do anything sinful. Not necessarily that you're not going to work, but the idea is to have a day of rest to get back in touch with God. And you stop and think about all the stuff you have to do and what you get into in your day-to-day life, and how distracting it is from God. And it's so hard to keep God as the focus of your day when you're out there having to load a truck, or when you're sitting in an office having to do a bunch of paperwork. So you want a Sabbath day, and Sabbath day is still Saturday. I don't know who, quote unquote, moved it to Sunday. It's never been Sunday. Now, we say Sunday is the Lord's Day because this is the day that God was resurrected. And there's evidence in the Gospels in Acts, where the apostles actually celebrated the resurrection of Christ on the Lord's Day. But the Sabbath is still Saturday. It's still sundown on Friday night is when the Sabbath starts. And so Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it starts on Sabbath on Friday night and goes for 7 days. And there might be some Hasidic Jews, I think I read, that do it for 8 days. Okay. Maybe it just ends on the 8th day. So I don't know. But God says here, do it for, work for 6 days, have all your stuff prepared so that on the 7th day you can rest and enjoy the day and communicate with God and have your Seder meal and do the things you're supposed to do to recharge yourself, so to speak, refresh yourself, so you can go into the next day and have the Spirit and have God with you and be in tune with Him, so that you can be a good disciple, be a good follower for the rest of the week, right? So that's your Sabbath, but it's like a reset day, and then you start your feasts. And so they always start on a Sabbath and basically end at the end of the next Sabbath. So one of the things they do on Passover, and if you've never done this before, I got a few more minutes to wrap this up. Find a Messianic synagogue that will let you come to their Seder for Passover. And I've been through an educational Seder. My father-in-law had a Messianic rabbi actually come, him and his family, and they came to my father-in-law's church, and my wife and I went up there, and he went through the whole Seder and taught the foods they eat and how they eat it, and the ritual procession of the whole thing, and the meanings of all of it, because there's deep meaning in a true Seder, and some kind of general things that you see in a Seder meal. There's 4 cups of wine. Now, Jewish wine is not near as strong as the Gentiles' wine as what we have today. If you're that concerned about it, Welch's grape juice is kosher. It's owned by the Welch family is Jewish, and so Welch's grape juice will be just fine. But there's 4 cups of wine through the whole entire Seder meal. There's vegetables dipped in salt water. There's ritualistic hand washing stuff. Again, Christ talks about this when he's confronting the Sadducees and the Pharisees. They're like, "Oh, you're eating. These people haven't washed their hands, and you're eating with them." And but again, you want to do a proper Seder meal. There's ritualistic hand washing at the beginning and the end of this. Like I said, there's vegetables dipped in salt water, bitter herbs like horseradish, a few other things. And there's some sweet stuff too. There was some kind of apple, honey, cinnamon concoction thing with something else mixed in. It was very good. So you have bitter and sweet things to remind you of like this bittersweet relationship with God, and some of the things he does that seem harsh, but in the end are actually for your own benefit. And so there's meanings to all of that, right? And then you get to the actual meal part. Now, we had lamb at this particular Seder meal that I had, but they can have like a type of chicken soup, gefilte fish, or lamb. And I mean, there's a little bit of, you have some options there based on your palate. But and then one of the big things is scriptural readings, or readings from the Haggadah, which is some Hebrew writings, and you can find it translated to English if you're unable to read Hebrew. So I would highly recommend finding a church, finding a Messianic synagogue near you that is going to do a Seder meal for Easter, well, for the Passover. And check it out. Go and check it out and see what it's about. Learn more about Passover, what it meant, and so that's the first of 7 ordained feasts or holidays in the Bible, ordained by God, not by man. So this is God's stuff, and like I said, it doesn't hurt to observe these things. So we'll get into unleavened bread next time. Then there's the first fruits. There's Pentecost, Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. So we're going to cover all those things over the next few weeks. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. God bless, and I hope your day is nice and easy and things warm up.